Ladies and gentlemen, after these highly interesting lectures, I have to begin with a confession. I have to confess that I am not an expert on Balkans, in spite some of my ancestors who came from the Balkans, in spite of my relatives, Croatian relatives who are living in Zagreb, and in spite of my father-in-law who spent a long time working in Chisinau, representing a Transylvanian factory. But I am an expert on Islam, and from this point of view, I am going to speak, and I will move along a different line as compared to the previous interesting lectures. Accordingly, my paper will be terribly boring, but still I will speak about some questions of the Balkans, because Balkan belongs partly to my sphere of interest. What I'm going to say consists of one introduction and 4 chapters. The introduction. As all we know, Balkan area was a buffer zone already in the antiquity and onward. It is enough to remember the conflict of the Latin and Greek cultures here, and, as a consequence, the debate of the Eastern and Western churches about the right to convert the region. This debate and the following resentfulness played a significant role in the separation of the Eastern Orthodox Church from the Western Catholic Church. This fact implies a major break in the peninsula. This was the introduction. And the first chapter, the difference between the culture of the Greek and Latin countries, first as seen from Europe, from West, and then as seen from the Balkans, as seen from the West. As Western historians see, in the Eastern Roman Empire there was one ruler who owned both potestas and auctoritas, whereas in the West there were many countries and many rulers who owned potestas, but auctoritas was owned by the Pope and the Church. The competition between them contributed to the quick development of the Western countries throughout the history. In addition, there were many independent units, royal boroughs, guilds, and so on, which, having paid their taxes, were free to manage their affairs according to their best knowledge. This democratic model resulted in the rapid growth of the West. This model was opposed by the Orthodox tradition. In this model, there was one God in the heavens and one king on earth, who protected both his country and the Christian church, having both potestas and auctoritas, as described and demanded by Eusebius, the church father. In the Western political tradition, the power was shared by many actors, as prescribed by Aristotle, legislative, executive, and judicial power, whereas in the East, a part of the royal power was delegated to servants of the king, who had to implement the will of their ruler. If a clerk had better ideas than his ruler, then he was considered rebel. This is the difference between the Greek Orthodox and Latin, let us say Catholic and Protestant states in the West, resulted in a different speed of development and different social and political structures. The first one implies a democratic structure, the second one an authoritarian structure. This difference in culture explains partly the split of Yugoslavia and many other hostilities in the region. The two political cultures and mindsets go back to political philosophies of Plato in the East and Aristotle in the West. This explains why political leaders in the East pretend to be philosophers. This explains why Lenin and Stalin and the others wrote huge volumes, and why the newspapers of the former socialist countries tried to lead the people on the right path by withholding or distorting the truth. This is what Plato allowed to philosophers. This orthodox mentality was reflected by the invitation of the Hungarian government in 1956 to Turkey to negotiate with the leaders of the Soviet army about their withdrawal, but instead of negotiations, the Soviets captured the Hungarian government that was not prepared to such a fraud. Another fine example of the difference between the two political traditions is that Karadzic, for his role in the Balkan Wars, received the Order of St. George from the Greek government as defender of orthodoxy, and for the same activity he was declared a war criminal and sentenced to prison in the West. It follows from what has been said that the social and economic development of the Balkans lagged behind the West, and culturally the Balkan countries turned toward Greece and towards the Third Byzantium, that is Moscow, if one speaks of the Slavonic countries. And now the same question as seen from the Balkans, from the Orthodoxy. What was just said just now makes it clear why the West is so distrustful of Balkans. However, one should not think that the attitude of orthodoxy towards the West is more positive. Enough to remind us of the doctrine that the orthodoxy, being depository of the true faith, is morally superior to the West, which is prone to decline and destruction. At the time of the Soviet Union, this very doctrine was known in its red version, which proclaimed the victory of socialism over capitalism. Further, one should recall how fiercely was opposed the post-visit in Greece and later in Turkey in a similar way, just to mention another example. Now, Chapter 2, Balkans and Islam. The Balkan area was for centuries exposed to successful Islamic conquest. The Muslim Turks were foreign invaders in the Balkans that was inhabited by Christians. Nevertheless, some aspects of the Islamic tradition were consistent with the Orthodox tradition. The Islam, following the doctrine of Eusebius, proclaims that there is one God in the heavens, consequently there must be one ruler on earth. And the rebellion against the ruler is rebellion against God. The ruler's duty is to defend the religion, and he is considered the head of the church. He delegates head of the religion, naturally. He delegates some parts of his power to his leading companions, who obligatorily act on behalf of the ruler, implementing his will. Thus, the structure of the Orthodox and Islamic societies is basically the same. In the Islamic world, too, Plato is the source of political philosophy. This explains the startling similarity between the behavior of Turks in 1541 and the Soviet military leaders in 1956, as mentioned above. In 1541, the Turks invited the Hungarian queen and her leading elite to a meal, but instead of a meal, they captured the Hungarian leading elite, imprisoned them, and so they opened the way for the occupation of Buda. The pattern and the scenario was exactly the same. The just mentioned similarities of mentality explain why Turkey could remain in the Balkans for hundreds of years. Enough to refer to the case of the Sokolovich family. One brother, Sokolovich Mehmet, was the vizier of the Turkish army, and his brother was the head of the Serbian Orthodox Church. It means that Islam and Orthodoxy coexisted peacefully in one and the same family. Serbia, as many other states in the Balkans, were in the Islamic sphere of influence until the establishment of the independent kingdoms in the 19th century, following the Russo-Turkish War in 1877-1878. In this war, the pan-Slavic idea played a major role and contributed to the firm reputation of Russia in the Balkans, which defines the political orientation of the Orthodox Slavonic states until now. Summarizing what has been said, one has to say that there is a cultural dividing line between the Western Latin and the Eastern Orthodox countries, which is reflected in both the social and economic systems and the political culture, I mean authoritarian or democratic regimes. However, this cultural identity, as well as in several countries, the Slavonic conscience, explain the Eastern political orientation of the Balkans. This situation is rendered more complicated by the fact that the long Turkish occupation created various Muslim groups in the peninsula. First, one has to mention the Turkish and Tatar minorities in the territory of Bulgaria and Romania. The second type of minorities can be represented by the Albanian Muslims, who, abandoning their Christian faith, converted more or less voluntarily to Islam. The third type is represented by the Muslims in Bosnia, They were originally adherents of a Christian heresy, Bogumil or Qatar, who emigrated from Croatia and later, abandoning their heresy, embraced Islam and became Orthodox Muslims. The existence of these groups in the Balkans means partly religious and ethnic tensions. For example, in Macedonia, the Christian Macedonians speak a Slavonic language, whereas Muslim Albanians speak another language. The Bosnian Izetbegovic wrote in his book that he never would live together with Christians in one state. This severe sentence had serious consequences in the Balkan War in the 90s. The Bosnian Muslims are separated from the Orthodox Serbs and Catholic Croats partly by language and partly by faith. The Turks and Tatars are different from the surrounding indigenous nations in every respect. And chapter 3, the influence of the past on our contemporary world. First, the traditional forces and then emergence of new forces. Traditional forces. In the present situation, it is important to know that Islam considers all lands that were conquered once in the history as belonging eternally to Dar al-Islam. Typically, attitude of Islam was expressed in an interview transmitted by Al Jazeera television. The head of a Moroccan government delegation preparing for an official visit to Spain was interviewed about how he feels before his visit to the land of his ancestors from where his family was expelled and which is currently under Spanish occupation. According to this mentality, the Balkans belong today to the area of Sunni Islam, which is being temporarily under Greek, Macedonian, Bulgarian, and Serbian, and so on occupation. A part of Hungary is to be included. In this spirit, the Sunni Islam has claim on this area, and Muslims living there are waiting for the help of their Muslim brothers. However, there are two forms of the Muslim assistance. One is the increasing Turkish influence. Many Muslims in the Balkans, even in the 60s and 70s, spoke Turkish fluently. And since that time, many of them have got formation at Turkish universities. In several places, mosques have been built by Turkish aid, indicating that the Turkish Hanafi Islam is present in the peninsula. Knowing this situation, one might say that as long as the Latin Europe observes the events in the Balkans from a geographic and intellectual distance, the Orthodox Christians are oriented towards Russia and Russia towards the Balkans, and the Muslim ethnic groups turn towards Turkey. Both of them are at home in the Balkans, and in a certain respect they represent cognate cultures, I mean the Orthodox and the Islamic culture. This means that the Balkans is open to further external influence, provided that it is not alien to the prevailing traditions. The emergence of new forces. Since the 90s, the Muslim force that intervened at all the hotspots of the world of Islam has been embodied in Saudi Arabia. In the country, which had given aid to poorer Arab countries too, although its aid always aimed at the strengthening of Islam too. In the 80s, working in the war-torn Syria, one was struck by the large number of new mosques and the women who, having abandoned the former European habit, began to dress traditional abaya and veils. It was rumored that every family whose female members were willing to take on traditional clothing received regular monthly allowance. Both the new mosques and the conservative conduct were financed from the Saudi aid given to Syria. The same holds true for Egypt. Thus, Saudi Arabia has been reputed to be giving financial aid to both the war-torn and poverty-stricken areas, but in both places the financial aid has been combined with ideological penetration, spreading the ideals of the severe Wahhabi Islam. It is quite understandable that Saudi Arabia came on the scene during the Balkan Wars under the pretext of Muslim solidarity, as it was done in many other war zones, for example, in the Chechen War as well. The Saudi presence, however, have been accompanied by the usual phenomena, building new mosques, which included the employment of proper imams, too, and the return of women to traditional clothing and the spread of Wahhabi Islam. In the last years, it means the spread of the idea of caliphate as well. Thus, the Saudi penetration was essentially different from the Turkish one. The Turkish government, at least during the Balkan War, clearly regarded himself as a secular state whose official religion is Islam. All Turkish assistance to the Muslim communities in the Balkans served the interests of the secular Turkish state and its national purposes. The basic aim was, even if only partially, to restore the influence of the Ottoman Empire in its former territory. It ran parallel to the Russian aspirations, which also want to keep the area in the Russian sphere of interest with reference to the common Slavonic and religious background. Thus, both Turkey and Russia want to sit at the table when decisions are taken in this important strategic part of the world. Saudi Arabia, by contrast, doesn't keep national interests in mind. Saudi Arabia supports everywhere the most traditional form of Islam, and so it aims to become the leading religious authority in the Islamic world and to become again a major factor in the family of the Islamic countries. The penetration of Saudi Arabia is purely of ideological nature, and it is only its second intention to increase the prestige of the kingdom in the international political life. To be short, the Ottoman and the Saudi intervention are not directed against each other. They run in parallel and mutually reinforce one another. In addition, the strengthening of Saudi influence in the Balkans follows the well-known pattern: provision of financial support, which provides the building mosques with payment of appropriate imams, and return to traditional clothing and strict Islamic morals, and naturally, as a consequence, to be present in Europe. Actually, seeing the large number of migrants to Europe, Saudi Arabia offered help, announcing its readiness to construct a lot of mosques and to provide them with proper imams as well. The same pattern was followed last year in Europe with this offer. The aim of this aid is the ideological penetration to Europe. The Balkans, due to the cultural affinity between Islam and Orthodoxy, economic weakness, and ethnic tensions, were defenseless against the economically founded Saudi penetration, unlike the economically better off culturally and culturally more different Europe, which is in addition generally hostile to all forms of religion. And the final chapter, Islam and Europe. However, the Christians in the Balkans hope in vain for help from Europe. Due to the consequence of its colonial past and its own ideological obsession, Europe is not able to judge impartially the specific troubles it faces. Consequently, Europe refused to put the sentence into the European Constitution that Europe is a Christian continent. However, the Christian countries of the Balkans aspiring to membership in the European Union would need badly this sentence in their internal struggle against Islam and Islamic minorities. In addition, European countries are not able to offer any attractive alternative to the Balkan countries as compared to Islam or Russia, asserting moral superiority in full harmony with each other. The European Union often refers to European values without specifying them. If one looks at what Europe offers to the Balkans and other areas of the world, one finds only ideological moral nihilism, hedonism, and egoism. These are at any rate unacceptable for peoples attached to Orthodoxy or Islam. However, Europe is too much occupied with protection of rights of homosexuals and other groups as to take notice how abhorrent these ideas are for other cultures, especially if Europe is ready to give the poor countries financial aid on the condition that they acknowledge homosexual marriage. So the peoples of Balkans get only criticism from Europe if they actively express their aversion and dissatisfaction in pride parades and marches. Of course, all this reinforces their traditional Orthodox or Islamic concept of the decline and destruction of the Latin West. This conviction cannot be made forgotten by the fragile prosperity offered by the Western in return. Let us recall that some years ago in Budapest, the proclamation supporting the Pride March was signed by more than 10 European ambassadors. Other events evoking similar diplomatic interest didn't occur in Hungary in the last 100 years. In these circumstances, the Saudi assistance becomes more valuable because it is not combined with destruction of traditional values in a society which feel morally superior, but on the contrary, it demands the strict observation of the accepted moral standards. And through this gate infiltrates the idea of caliphate as well to the Balkans. Especially because the Islamic State is not defined by borders. It doesn't belong to the concept of state to have borders. So you can be quite easily in the Balkans and in Syria, and you belong to the same state. The Balkan states are thus born between two millstones. On the one hand, as Christian states, they look for alliance with the Christian Europe. On the other hand, they refuse the morality of Europe. They look for and find alliance in Moscow, but they meet unwillingness in Europe for cultural and political reasons. At the same time, they experience the interest of the strong and rich Muslim states. As Christians, they refuse the Islamic faith, but at the same time, they don't feel the Islamic culture alien to their own Orthodox culture. They refuse the external support of their Muslim minorities, but in this respect, Saudi Arabia is more remote danger than Turkey, which is at the next door. This explains the success of the Saudi expansion. In this situation, one should look for a possible new solution to this dilemma. Perhaps it can be the stronger cooperation of the countries of the region that have similar history, similar experience, and more or less similar culture, in spite of religious, Latin and Greek differences. This solution, however, demands the healing of some open wounds among them. Thank you for your attention.